got quite a lot of attention, including from us, when CNN and others of my colleagues on this panel were excluded from a gaggle and off-camera briefing that Sean Spicer held. And we covered it extensively as a news story, saying that it was unprecedented in modern history that there would be an announced gaggle and then particular reporters would be selectively excluded from that. The administration hasn't done it again, but we covered it extensively both on television and on digital. The White House Correspondents Association weighed in on our behalf. And I was also, speaking of how reporters handle it in the moment, I was very gratified to see that a number of reporters from rival organizations decided on the spur of the moment that they also would not attend. And you don't see that a lot because, as I was saying, we're all fierce competitors here. And I think that speaks to how unusual the circumstances were. And I was pleased to see that from other news organizations.
Yeah, Politico was also excluded from that one. And I have actually a slightly different take, I think, than Rachel on this. I was a White House reporter for many years, and there were quite a few on background senior briefings with senior administration officials that Politico was excluded from because of the basis of our reporting. That is different than an announced gaggle. Right. That I agree with that, but that did inform my response as an editor, that I saw some pretty, what I felt, overheated statements from media organizations on this, and I chose to go with a more moderated tone, in part because I felt that it was unacceptable. I felt it was the start of a bad practice, but in my view, it was also perhaps I needed room to go up in terms of how loud I would raise my voice, and I couldn't start at DEFCON whatever, because this to me was bad practice and unacceptable, but I needed room to grow in terms of how we're going to respond. We covered it. I found it unacceptable, but I was also excluded from Obama administration briefings and was aware that this is not the worst thing that could happen. It's bad practice, but we need room to grow. So that was my perspective on it.
We at CBS also had a slightly different take on that particular incident because on that day, CBS was radio pool, so our pooler went in to the briefing and made the audio available to everybody afterwards, right. which is practice, and we think we stand by that decision. We think that was the right thing to do. It was newsworthy. We felt an obligation as a pooler to participate in that. So we did not participate in the boycott because we were a pool. I would also say that we joined the protests. Both the White House Correspondents Association and the TV bureau chiefs made it clear that this was bad practice, and so we did protest it, and obviously happy to see that it hasn't recurred.
But I agree with Rachel. Like, the most heartening part of this was the fact that you had, I think the LA Times maybe in part, but other networks that did, or the AP. That is unusual, and that is the only thing that will. We have to do that. And I was disappointed, like I was in Brussels last year for a job, but I was disappointed when the Trump organization started started preventing certain organizations from being part of events. And Politico eventually was part of that, but it was like the Huffington Post, it was BuzzFeed, it wasn't the big players. So we didn't get sort of that solidarity because it wasn't the New York Times or the Washington Post, and that was, for months Politico was prevented from covering his events. We had to find very creative ways to do it, and I think why this one was one and done is because you had the AP, you had CBS, that there's a better organization to do that, and I will encourage Politico will stand in solidarity with other news organizations that face this. That's the only sort of recourse we have.
We did have a similar situation that came up in the Obama administration, in which there was a round robin of interviews that was being offered to the pool, and the White House attempted to exclude Fox from the rotation. And at the time, I was actually pool chair. And I told the White House at that time that that was unacceptable, and that Fox was a member of the pool. There were 5 members of the pool. The White House does not choose who belongs to the pool. We do.
It's important to note when these things break with precedent, to make it a story. It's also important to remember that at the end of the day, Americans going about their lives, this is not their top priority, whether we got into a gaggle or didn't get into a gaggle. So to Carrie's point, I do think that we need to cover these things. We need to protest, but we also need to keep in perspective where people's focus are.
And it goes back to the point someone was made earlier, that if the media reacted too strongly, then you become the enemy that they say you are.
Exactly.
Versus a reasonable group that is trying to get some transparency about what's going on here.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because I think in that particular incident, that almost certainly was the thinking behind doing the gaggle. Let's do this. Let's see if we can get a rise out of them. And because there were other things going on that they would prefer not to talk about that week. And I think the fact that it hasn't been repeated indicates 2 things. One is that, we all did cover it, and we all did say, this is a break from precedent, and here's why it's problematic from the standpoint of the public getting information, not from the standpoint of us, but from the standpoint of the public. Here's why this kind of thing is problematic.